Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming out on a great day. My name's Tom Lenny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture at Holy Cross. A few years ago, the McFarland Center launched an initiative called Catholics and Cultures to explore the religious lives and practices of different regions and cultural settings around the world. Our website, catholicsandcultures.org, which some of you may have seen, features articles, photos, videos, and demographic data on themes like feasts, holidays, shrines, pilgrimage, family, gender roles, food, fasting, devotion, all sorts of themes relating to Marian the saints as well. Some examples, a 10-day religious dance feast in La Tirana in Chile that was one of the more amazing things I've ever been to in my life, in honor of the Virgen del Carmen, so another manifestation of the Virgin, or the month-long Flores de Mayo in the Philippines. Today we have a chance to explore another Marian devotion that we're going to look at. I should also mention, under the leadership of Mark Lestow and Matt Schmaltz, we sponsor a journal called the Journal of Global Catholicism for scholarly insight on global Catholicism. Today we have a great opportunity to learn about Catholic devotional practice in a country that's not featured in either of those venues, from a scholar who has done some really great work on that. Jalane Schmidt is here to share her research on Cuban devotion to Our Lady of Charity of El Cobre, the patron saint of Cuba, known colloquially as Cachita. Jalane is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. She's author of a great book called Cachita Streets, The Virgin of Charity, Race, and Revolution in Cuba, published in 2015. The book compares religious rituals to Cachita to other contemporaneous Cuban street events, including carnival protests and revolutionary rallies, where organizers stage performances of contested definitions of Cubanness. Her current work explores how the history of slavery is performed in spirit possession rituals and expressed in material culture. Jalane's also been very active in resisting countering the white nationalist demonstrations in her now hometown of Charlottesville during the summer. Tomorrow she'll be sharing some reflections on the events and the racist history that set the stage for the August confrontation. We have a few spots left for that lunch. If people are interested in that, you can see me or email crec.holycross.edu if you want to join us for a pizza lunch discussion on that tomorrow. Meanwhile, please join me in welcoming Jalane Schmidt.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Thanks for coming, everyone. I want to thank the Holy Cross McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture for inviting me. And I see that you have my Connecticut College colleague, Frank Graziano, is coming later this week, I guess, to talk about. Was it? Oh, okay. He's been here, but I think is it Stephen Selka also? He was also. So you've had some good people that are doing stuff on popular Catholicism. So I'm glad that you're hosting these Catholics and Culture events to highlight global Catholicism. So I'm Jalane Schmidt, as Tom introduced me, and for 20 years now I've been doing field research in Cuba. Field research, that's where you go and kind of live daily life with folks in the field, and in my case it meant drinking a lot of coffee with a lot of viejitas, with a lot of little old ladies who shared with me their wisdom and were very welcoming. I also did archival research in both church and state archives in Cuba, and had all sorts of adventures living in Cuban society as a North American when I went there. So, as Tom said, my research looks at the patron saint of Cuba and popular devotion to her. I'm an anthropologist, and it's my operating assumption that religion intersects with all other structures of society, whether about gender, race, sexuality, politics, etc. And so in my treatment of this Marian devotion, I don't privilege clerical perspectives. That is, it's not a theological account, although I do give an account of people's Marian conceptions, certainly, but rather I'm looking at popular practices of the majority of devotees, whether these are lay Catholics or practitioners of Santeria, which is an Afro-Cuban religion, or spirit medium practices, or this sort of thing. So in this Cuban case, I should do this here, this Marian devotion has taken many local forms, whether it's inflected by indigenous or African elements. And over the centuries, church officials and state officials also have tried to nudge these devotions in one way or another in directions they found more acceptable. And people on the ground have their own ideas of what is acceptable, of course, and so part of what I was studying is the tensions that exist in this cult here. And particularly, as he mentioned, my book is called Cachita Streets, and so I looked at street demonstrations and how devotion was manifested in the streets, because the streets are what people try to commandeer, control, etc., to try to display what's what, or what they are trying to promote. So this is a holy card, very common one in Cuba. This depicts the kind of initial apparition of the Virgin of Charity in Cuba. And we see here in the boat here, these three guys here, gone out to collect salt, and they're colloquially, kind of affectionately known as the three Juans, the three guys named Juan. And at least in the original story that we have, it was two Taino men, that is indigenous men, Taino, and a enslaved black boy of the age of 10 who went out looking for salt and were caught in a storm, and the Virgin appears to them, and they collect her image from off the waves and bring it into their canoe and take her onto shore. This was in 1612, according to the apparition legend. So she gets to the shore with these two Indians and a black slave boy. One of the Indian men sets up a bohío, or a kind of a conical thatched hut, this sort of thing, and sets up a little shrine there and worships the Virgin, venerates the Virgin according to indigenous Taino practices. And it's then that the Spanish authorities, this catches their eye, because they are noticing, or the Indian keeps reporting, that the Virgin wanders away from her shrine at night, goes missing, and then she comes back later the next morning and her clothes are wet. And this is completely the opposite of when she was found on the sea, when she was miraculously dry. So there's all sorts of miracle stories attributed to her. But according to the report of an early Catholic chaplain, the Indian, Juan Rodrigo, reported that he wanted to keep her to himself, away from the whites. This was his goal. So this is the first instance, already in 1613, of the role of the debates over race and how they surround the popular devotion to Cachita, to the Virgin of Charity. So I wanted to highlight this just to say that there's never been a golden age of agreement and harmony, right, in this or perhaps any Marian cult. All right, it's always this contestation over the symbol, and this is precisely what I'm looking at here. So these Spanish colonial authorities were concerned about the image, about the Marian image, and what might befall it if it was in the control of this Indian devotee. And so the colonial and church officials decided to commandeer the image, to protect it, and to take it to a shrine in El Cobre, which is where it resides to this day, which is where the National Shrine of Our Lady of Charity is located. It's a small little town, a copper mining town, thus the name Cobre, which is Spanish for copper. And that's where her shrine was, and the successive shrines were built by enslaved copper miners there in this community. So these, just wanted to note the iconography here, that the Virgin has brown skin and curly hair, and this is something that Cubans have deemed very important. Even the earliest reports from the chaplains describe her as una Virgen Morena, a brown virgin, not unlike Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico, if you're familiar with that. And then the Christ child is very light complexioned, which would seem to suggest white paternity, right? As if God the Father is white. This is something. And so in the Cuban racial calculus, a darker complexioned parent who has a child with a lighter complexioned partner is said to have improved the race. I mean, here's this white supremacist pigmentocracy that is at work here. So the Christ child is something of a divine adelantado, if you will, to use Cuban racial taxonomy, right? The advanced one, as it were. So her image was brought from the presence of the Indians, where it had been on the shore, to this town for safekeeping in the shrine. And there, interestingly, her primary devotees were the community of enslaved miners. They were from the Congo and they were from Angola, predominantly this time. So this is this brown saint and her racial representation are something that Cubans have debated over the centuries and have attached different meanings at different times to her skin color. And one of the things that I looked at in my research was how reports of her complexion changed over time, or depending on what group of people were evaluating this. So this is one of the kind of important events in the growth of any popular cult to any saint are the kind of notarized testimonies that are given, often by the seers, kind of the original folks who are said to have witnessed an apparition, right? And in this case, we do have, preserved in the archives, the report of Juan Moreno, who, if you remember, there we go. This is Juan Moreno, the enslaved boy. And this was said to have happened in 1612, and then when he was a very old man, he gave his testimony at the cathedral in Santiago de Cuba and recorded the apparition. And this was important for some of the clerics at that time, for some of the church leaders. They could attract more pilgrims to a shrine if there were kind of documented miracles and this sort of thing. So it was very important. And also what was happening was that the slaves in El Cobre were beginning to fight for their freedom. They had revolts on several occasions, and on each occasion, in the accounts that we have, they were appealing to the Virgin as their patron, as the patron of their liberation struggle. And they made various appeals over the centuries to the King of Spain to be freed. And they said, we deserve to be freed because the Virgin shows us special favor. Right? So here is also a theme that appears in many Marian stories, many Marian cults, of how Mary appears to the lowly. Right? Often the most marginalized sectors of society are said to be, kind of be privileged seers of the Virgin, and she assists them. And so it is also in this case as well. So finally, the Cobreros, the enslaved copper miners, they were successful. They were freed. 1801, about 85 years before general manumission on the island, and they credited the Virgin with their freedom. And still in this little town, it's a small town, and it's the town in Cuba with the highest proportion of Cubans of African descent in this little town. And they're very proud of their rebel past, of their rebel slave forebears, and they also had many forebears that fought in the Cuban Wars for Independence in the 19th century, and then in the Revolutionary War with Fidel Castro in the 20th century. So it's a fighting history, in this town that they're very proud of. And through it all, the folks, black folks and brown folks around in this part of Cuba have said that the Virgin has been with them, has blessed their struggles as they've appealed. Now, black folks around the shrine tended to affectionately refer to the Virgin. And here you see there's, kind of in this rendition here, you see the kind of, diaphanous Virgin is, in the background as he's giving his testimony about her. For a lot of Cubans living in that area of the country, they call her La Santa Prieta, the Black Saint. Yeah, and other folks in other part of the islands, and where more Spanish elements and populations predominate, depict her as white. Right? I mean, so there's a full range of racial depictions here that are going on. But one that took hold, the depiction that took hold, is like, as we saw here, this, where she's kind of brown-skinned. This is the most common image, or has become the most common image. But this in Cuba, which was the former slave society, much like United States and other countries in the Americas, she was referred to as a mulata, that is a person of both African and European descent. And for many Cubans, this ascription of mulataness to their patron saint is said to be very important because Cubans themselves are a mixture of Spain and Africa, and so there, of course, our Virgin would be just like us. It's often said, that was reported to me in the field. Kind of like, again, if you know the case of Our Lady of Guadalupe in Mexico, how she's often referred to as Virgen Morena, and Mexicans find that very, very meaningful, that she's one of us, as it's said. So, but what does it mean when to be one of us, when to be mulata, has some negative connotations here, which there's some tinges of kind of negative valences that, owing to the slave regime, during slavery time, that is attached to being of mixed race, particularly a woman of mixed race. So here we have here a mulata who she's a woman of the street, she's a prostitute, she's trying to attract a client here, a white man, and someone is yelling a warning here, don't throw it in the street, there's sewage there. So it's an association of the streets as a sort of morally compromised, certainly hygienically compromised space, and that this woman is inhabiting, that space there too. And then compared to this light-complexioned woman over here, whose kind of moral standing is unblemished, shall we say, right? So this is there are many different songs, proverbs, poems, novels, etc., which all have these mulata characters that usually have some sort of moral compromise that is of their own doing. So there's always a kind of cautionary tale that's directed to the listener or the reader about, don't trust these women. They're kind of straddling this boundary between black and white, and you can't trust that. So then my question was, well, then what does it mean to have a patron saint who is often identified as a mulata? If you've got these dynamics going on, racial dynamics going on, what does it mean? And I said, I've got to get to the bottom of this. This is too interesting. So, among Cubans of African descent that practice at least one of the Afro-Cubans on the island, they identify Our Lady of Charity with a particular deity from their own pantheon named Ochun, who is associated with fresh waters, fecundity, fertility, etc. But she's also she's said to be flirtatious, coquettish. She isn't an honorable woman so much. It doesn't care so much about being a mother as she does about pursuing men and sexual relationships with men, this sort of thing. So I found it curious then that for many Cubans, that Mary, the ever-Virgin Mother of God, would be connected with, what at least in kind of Santeria portrayals of their divine pantheon is called the La Puta Sagrada. That is the holy whore, if you will, going on. So, so here's a very interesting connection, and it seems to be saying a lot about ideals of womanhood, that kind of very conflicted about sexuality, whether to be supposedly chaste and, mother versus, kind of more sexually assertive woman, this sort of thing. So there are these tensions there that are being said about women that are also being cast onto the divine realm as well, that are being said here in this very identification that people have forged between Our Lady of Charity and Ochun. And of course, Ochun is often depicted as a mulata that follows perfectly the kind of Cuban racial ideology of not only kind of ideals of beauty, but also kind of a cautionary tale, again, and the kind of ranges of possibilities for women's agency or not. Another kind of important image of the Virgin of Charity is that of the Virgin Mambise. So this is the here. This is the arch from the cathedral in Bayamo, Cuba. And I don't know if you can see up here, floating up here is the Virgin, way up there, up at the top, and there's the seal of Cuba underneath, and then here's the kind of the first Cuban flag here, and the priest is blessing the flag, and the guy in the bow tie there is Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, who's kind of like the George Washington of Cuba, one of the early independence leaders in the 19th century when Cuba was seeking independence from Spain. So this Virgen Mambise, that is the kind of the independence struggle Virgin of Charity, is kind of became the preferred narrative of Catholic clerics and also government officials, because it's very much tied with the struggle to be an independent sovereign nation, against Spain. And also there's none of this messy, narratives having to deal with slaves and having revolts and running away and mulattonous and sexually loose deities and all this sort of thing. It's kind of a more clean narrative. This was kind of the preferred narrative of the authorities, and one which certainly gets attention in my work because it's very important. But I'm also kind of writing against it because I'm interested in seeing what kind of everyday Cubans are saying about their own devotions. But it's very important to note this, But here it is. Here's Carlos Manuel de Céspedes. He's a slaveholder, as were many of the independence leaders there. But this, and it was through the battlefields that devotion to Our Lady of Charity spread, literally in the battlefields there, as more and more soldiers were coming together from different parts of Cuba, learning about this devotion of a truly Cuban virgin, who would come to Cuba, and appealing to her as the patron of the independence struggle. And it's through, so these, and it should be said that the majority of the church hierarchy was opposed to Cuban independence because the majority of the church hierarchy at that time in the 19th century was Spanish. They wanted to maintain Spanish rule of Cuba. So the devotion to her did not spread through official church channels. All right? It spread through a more kind of popular profusion of different practices like, burning a candle in one's home, pilgrimages, and this sort of Santeria ceremonies and this sort of thing, right? Because, the Catholic hierarchy, really until after the Revolution, was not very attentive to this devotion, notwithstanding the fact that it was the most popular saint's avocation among Cuban people, all right? So and instead, there was a lot of fear that the cult to the Virgin was suffused with so-called superstition, all right? So this is the newspaper account here of a raid that was conducted on a Santeria house temple there in Santiago. And it says there that these are the objects that were seized in a witchcraft center in this city when the people inside were celebrating a grotesque festival, a vigil festival of La Caridad. Right? So this, this is on the front page of the paper. This is, showing this. So there's, very much a repression against Afro-Cuban religious devotion, such as the devotion to Ochun, right? So these people would have been celebrating their own version of Marian devotion, right? That would put forward, Ochun, and also, coupled with Catholic prayers, saying the Hail Mary, etc. All sorts of a mixture of African and Catholic devotions going on, but not approved by the authorities. Instead, the police are trying to bust it. The church is fighting a rearguard action, church hierarchy that is, to try to purge these supposedly unhygienic practices, from the flock and this sort of thing. So at this time, in the 1930s, there's kind of an evaluation going on about Afro-Cuban elements to national culture, and some folks, some writers, and musicians, intellectuals are starting to reevaluate African contributions to Cuban culture in a positive light. That is, they're kind of riding against the grain. And this is going on all over the Americas. You have, if you go to Mexico, Jose Vasconcelos there is writing La Raza Cósmica. If you're, 1920s New York City, the Harlem Renaissance is going on. It's going on in a lot of places. This kind of reevaluation of African and indigenous components to national culture. And so it was in Cuba as well. And so here we have a painting that was done, and it's kind of an Afro-Cuban inflected version of Marian iconography. So if you can see here, it's kind of, off kilter here. You can see the Virgin up there, and she has fairly dark complexioned there. And here's the three wands, in the boat. It's kind of stylized, right? And there's the lightning, which kind of symbolizes the storm on which the three wands were floating, right? When they first found the Virgin. But also the flashing lightning could be kind of a nod to Shango, who is a deity from Santeria, who is the paramour of Ochun, too. So there's all sorts of kind of mixing, if you have cultural eyes to see, right, of what's going on here. But this is an assertion, of the possibilities that there can be in visual arts, in just considering Cuban culture, when African elements are elevated, right? At that same time, there was a counter movement among more elite Cubans, those of Spanish descent, to privilege Spanish and Catholic elements in national culture. And one of the great public ceremonies of the 20th century that I look at was the coronation, a canonical coronation. This is a special, extraordinary set of liturgies that need Vatican approval, all right, in order to coronate a saint. And such it was in 1936, a huge outdoor ceremony, and here's the cardinal there placing the crown on the Virgin as everyone is standing around looking. But this, of course, foregrounded white Cubans. If you look at kind of the planning apparatus and the kind of the institutional supports and all this sort of thing, in the archival record, it's very much it was planned by white Cubans, let's put it that way. Now, this is about at the same time as the bust that we saw, the police, when they busted that ceremony that we saw on the front page. This is all going on in the 1930s here. So there's a kind of a push and pull in terms of what elements, Spanish or African poles, right, of Cuban culture are going to be privileged in the national discussion. And here we can see it going on here. But in the case of the Afro-Cuban religious stuff, even though it's taking place in the confines of a home, it's still being attacked by the police, right? Whereas the more kind of orthodox expressions, of course, have pride of place in the streets, right, as a sort of display, right? And so this is, interestingly, the folks who wrote the final report for this coronation in 1936 described the Virgin as white. They were very adamant. She was white, right? There we go. But here we can see in the 1950s, this is right when some of the rebels were starting to get their campaign going against the Batista regime, all right, in Cuba. That was supported by the United States. So the 1950s was very fraught in Cuba as people were trying to figure out the direction of the country, all right? So here we have, kind of this is both September 1954, these are the two largest circulating kind of cultural magazines in Cuba at the time. And we see in the one on, I guess it's your left, yes, if you see that, note that this is a white woman here on the left, and she's barefoot, as if she's made a promise. This is a very kind of classic gesture of piety, Catholic piety, right? To take off one's shoes and maybe walk the final mile to the shrine, barefoot, or some people will walk the whole way, right? Barefoot is a sort of bodily mortification, fleshly mortification, sort of offering, to go to the thing. So here she has her shoes off. She's got a mantilla. This is pre-Vatican II, right? She's piously inside of a church with her daughters, and the Virgin is white. See that there? So that's one version. Now over here we have two black women. Note the seductive gaze, the décolletage of the woman, and the sort of emphasis on black physicality in the Cuban imaginary, which highlights kind of sexual enticingness, this sort of thing. And they are bringing fruit to their altar inside their home, which this kind of implies that these are Santeria practitioners, okay, just given the sorts of devotions that are being highlighted there. And their virgin kind of has more of a brown face there, so here, kind of these images circulated, and this, these practices were known, right? They didn't always meet with widespread approval, but, there it is. And during this time, in the 1950s, polls taken by Catholic organizations showed that the church's reach in terms of congregations and attendance and this sort of thing was fairly weak. It was the weakest in Latin America, actually. And one Monsignor that I spoke to about this, in the early 2000s, especially about rural Cuba, he said it was muy mal entendida. It was not very well served, and yet, before the revolution, the majority of the Cuban population lived in el campo, lived in the country, where there weren't very many churches, right? This sort of thing. And that is where the revolutionary struggle really took hold, was in these rural spaces, right? So then, when the revolution triumphed in 1959, and I should say that there's a whole lot of drama, which we can talk about in Q&A, around the Virgin's very shrine. There were many, many battles that happened with the revolution, and one of the rebels' shells, hit the church, and all the windows broke, and all the saints except the Virgin the Virgin was spared, but all the other saints were broken, and a lot of drama. But in any case, the revolution did triumph. I should go back here. Yeah. And there were many, many rallies held in public places, in streets, and the revolution pressed for social and racial justice, precisely for these residents, these rural residents, and Castro made, many speeches where he talked about combating racism, and this was upsetting to some white folks there who didn't like any sort of public mention of race. Sound familiar? No? All right. Yeah. So at a speech at the University of Havana on the night before a large Catholic gathering, Castro invoked the Virgin as the protector of poor black fishermen, he said, and he kind of was counterposing, those three wands, right, in the boat. He was counterposing the status of the three wands to the concerns of the Pharisees, and that's how he referred to his white elite critics, many of whom were Catholic too. And so, in 1959, so the revolution triumphs on January the 1st, 1959, and throughout 1959, as there were more and more radical changes that were taking place in the revolutionary government, the church had become a space where dissidents kind of tended to congregate, went to there. And there was a show of strength at the Catholic Congress that was sponsored that year that rivaled the scope and attendance at some of Castro's rallies. So this kind of put the revolutionary government on notice, that the church could hold a rally, and over here you can't. So there's Jose Marti, which is kind of one of their independence leaders at that end of this huge space, and then here is the Virgin. So 1 million people gathered at this Eucharistic Congress in 1959, November 1959, and this was in the same space that Castro was holding his rally. So this kind of put the revolutionary government, they had, they were in attendance, all the officials, Castro and all of them were in attendance, but it was also, a bit of a laying down the gauntlet, saying that, we too can attract a public, in the streets. So, and this, I should say that at this, there were many different speeches that were given, and, as happens at these sorts of events and stuff. Very much, this is 1959, so there's a pre-Vatican II kind of charity model of helping rather than a kind of social justice model of addressing structures and this sort of thing. So these Catholic claims at that time were frankly inadequate, I will say, given the fast pace of changes that were going on, given the systemic problems that they were, not reading the signs of the times, right, as Gaudium et Spes would advise, several years later, right? So there was some racial shift in the church's framing. At this conference, the Virgin was described as softly brown, and remember before how they described her as adamantly white, right? So there's been a shift there, in the past 15 years or so. She's described as softly brown. But it was kind of in a way of kind of smoothing over racism and not admitting church complicity and production. That changes, about 30 years later. So while kind of white elite Catholics were uncomfortable with race talk, this was at the very moment that a very brash new revolutionary government was promising to address racism and persistent black poverty. So it was, a bit threatening to the government that a national symbol like the Virgin, who was, very long-standing symbol, was outside the government's control. All right, and that many, 1 million people were gathering there, that she was a rallying symbol. And what happened, just in a brief nutshell, a couple years later in 1961, on the Virgin's feast day, there was supposed to be a feast day procession in Havana. A brawl broke out, and somebody was killed, basically is what happened, outside the Church of Our Lady of Charity there in Havana. And this is the event that precipitated the government cracking down on religion in Cuba after the revolution. After this feast day celebration to Our Lady of Charity, the priests and nuns got rounded up, arrested. Many of them were expelled from the country. And some church institutions, the schools, church schools were shut down, church hospitals, church presses. I mean, basically all institutions except the churches themselves, and these were highly surveilled, right, by government agents. But the Virgin was in the mix of all of this. It was at her first feast day where the violence broke out, and this is what turned the government against religious expression. So all this occurred, making it very difficult to have any sort of religious devotion if you wanted to, say, go to university, or if you wanted to get a job, or if you wanted to get a raise, or any kind of social or political advancement. You could not be religious. Not even your parents. Maybe your grandpa, it's like, well, they would say, well, those old people, they can't really change. But if you wanted to go to university, you got to keep your nose clean, and that meant not wearing a robe. They wouldn't be wearing any kind of religious jewelry or going to religious gatherings because people were watching, all right? And they would tell, and then you wouldn't be able to advance as you would want. Let's see. And so this, you saw this as you walked in. So this makes this picture even more curious, all right? Because as I said, in 1961, that's when the crackdown on religious devotion happened, after the brawl at the Virgin's feast day. So a year later, Fidel Castro went to visit some of his comrades that he'd been, in the war with, made a visit through rural Cuba. And this picture was taken here. I have to say, and it was published for the first time in my book because it hadn't been allowed to be seen, because any sort of depiction of a revolutionary figure of stature of Fidel with a religious object was verboten, was prohibido, not allowed. This would not have been good politically. So the fact that this is taken says something, that this Guajiro, who had fought with Fidel in the battlefields, loved his Virgin. So this kind of points to the tensions that there are in Cuban society. Someone could be revolutionary, staunchly revolutionary, very loyal to Fidel a Fidel, be a revolutionary, be loyal to Fidel, and have a devotion to the Virgin all at the same time, as this Guajiro here clearly does, right? But the photographer knows that this is the problem, right? And so this photo is buried for 50 years. So that points to kind of at the official level of Cuban society, this was not acceptable, all right? Until basically the 1990s, all right? This is how things went. So here is a kind of more contemporary bembe or drumming ceremony for Ochun. This is at a friend's house in Cuba there, and this is a kind of an altar that's been built for La Caridad Ochun, right, in her kind of Ochun guise, for santeros, yeah. And so this was happening, that there was some thinking going on in church circles, specifically with respect to how to have a pastoral ministry in revolutionary Cuba that was true to the Cuban context, that wasn't just kind of encouraging people to leave, because that had been kind of the initial response in the 1960s, that priests and bishops were arranging for Catholics, largely white, to leave the island, because the revolution was thought, no, this is only going to last a few months, maybe a year. The Yankees are going to come in and kick these people out, and so it was just kind of a flood of folks going out. That is the kind of basically a lot of the upper echelons of the church, who were largely white, left. All right, and that left behind a much browner and poorer flock. Right. That the clerics, especially in reading some of the archival materials as I did, and all the interviews that I conducted, there wasn't really a pastoral ministry there for browner, poorer folks. All right. So then the question was, especially in light of the Second Vatican Council and the sort of more kind of local, being attentive to the signs of the times, and also being in a revolutionary context, what does it mean to be Roman Catholic in a Cuban revolutionary setting? This was the question. All right, so getting together and having meetings in the 1980s, church, big confab of lay people and also church hierarchy got together, and there was a noticed a real humility in the statements that were released from the INEC. It was called. It was Eclesia Nacional Eclesial Cubana, Encuentro Nacional Eclesial Cubano. Repentance for snobbery. This was, actual words that were used against people who practice these sorts of religions, right? And admission that the church had not been attentive to the needs of black and brown Cubans, all right? And a kind of recommitment to being the church in Cuba. Not the church trying to help people leave Cuba, but the church in Cuba, in a revolutionary milieu. So this was quite a turn of events here, from former elitist attitudes, their words that they used, and not a kind of triumphalist cozying up to governments, as had been the case before the revolution. But then there was this question about what to do with all these folks, these Cuban folks who have devotion to her, to Ochun, right? And there was, some discomfort with this, because they realized that, quite frankly, these sorts of devotions are more popular than Orthodox Catholicism. That's just the truth. Demographically, there is no other way to say it. That these sorts of devotions have more appeal. And so in the final report, the report doesn't mention Ochun by name, but rather makes reference to some deity of the Yoruba pantheon with values frankly incompatible with a Catholic doctrine of Maria. Right? This is kind of a reference to the kind of croquettish nature of Ochun. But this Ochun symbol resonates with a big sector of the public. So what to do? So for instance, during the special period after the fall of the Soviet Union, when all of the kind of economic supports go through the basement, it's very tough times in Cuba. The just abysmal economic conditions. And so Cuba turned to tourism to raise revenues. And there have been like 30 years of no foreigners coming in, except unless they were like Soviet, engineers or something like this, but no tourists. That had been ended with the revolution. So tourists are coming in, and this brings back some of the old racial and economic hierarchies that were supposedly vanquished by the revolution. They kind of sprung back into life. And so here an artist is actually offering a commentary here. So here is a picture. It's kind of a depiction of Ochun, this mulatta woman, exposed breast. She's got Ochun's 5-pointed hat. It says the temptation. And here's a Santeria deity here, and all these, luxurious foods that Cubans don't have access to because, there was so much poverty in the 1990s. And it's, all of Cuba is seemingly for sale. That this woman is kind of offering herself very suggestively. There's all this, this profusion of foods and stuff that were unavailable. One teacher commented to me during this time, with the rise of tourism and the upsurge in prostitution and the economic hierarchies reasserting themselves, she said, "We're the Thailand of the Caribbean." She was very woeful, that this, the sex tourism in Cuba had gone up so much that this was a primary source of revenues for folks on the island. So what does it mean, again, to have this devotion to Our Lady of Charity and Ochun, right, at a time when prostitution is the primary allied industry to the tourism industry, right? Especially when, a lot of these these sex workers have devotion to Ochun. Why? Because Ochun is said to assist with finding a man. She's very sexy, and she's a very, it makes sense to have devotion to this deity if your job is to try to attract clients, yeah, this direction. So here it is, kind of this embedded in the culture, all right, kind of commentary on women, women's roles, economics, race, etc. are going on. So here we have this. And here we have, again, kind of appropriations of this imagery that just kind of went more and more mainstream. This was no longer kind of inside the house. Remember where the guys in 1931 got their house temple busted by the police, and all their objects were seized and brought by the police. Well, this is very different. Now this is out on the street, right? This is not the police trying to bust up a Santeria ceremony, but here she is, as it were, right? But for a very different purpose here. In this case, the tourism industry is kind of a come hither stare, if you will, to potential clients, who might want to visit the island of Cuba. And the draw, again, is monetizing the bodies of Cuban women of color. This has been done before. Certainly during slavery time. This already, dates, talked about, how the mulatta and the Cuban imaginary, how this emerged during slavery time. Slave masters and enslaved women having an illicit relationship. And so here it is again. Also being deployed in advertising campaigns. We have here. So this is it's mulatta rum, inspired by the legend of Ochun, the Lukumi Venus, the African Venus in the mythology. Mulatta rum possesses an aroma and flavor, very particular, etc., etc. There's all sorts of licentious, if you can read Spanish, you can read that. But and then here also Santeria images being used to sell products, to marketing and branding products and this sort of thing. Again, very different than what we saw before, several decades before, right? When someone's house was busted into by the police and this stuff was seized. Now it's being used by government entities to market products, all right, for a tourist audience. So, what does that mean? Then enter the Pope, John Paul II. So this was a big breakthrough in revolutionary Cuba because for the first time in decades there were public religious ceremonies of the sort that we saw. Remember the coronation ceremony that we saw in the Catholic, 1936 and the 1959 Catholic Congress, these huge gatherings in plazas. That had been ended effectively for almost 40 years, right? After that brouhaha at the Virgin's Feast Day in 1961. But one of the conditions of John Paul II's visit was that public religious gatherings had to be publicized, had to be televised live. All right, and so this happened. This was quite an occurrence, newsworthy occurrence in Cuba, and one of the most beloved actions that happened during John Paul's time in the island was him recrowning the Virgin. Notice here the Christ child is brown here too. All right, so this is, and the Pope talked about. He didn't mention the Virgin's race per se, but he did speak of the three Juans as a multiracial group of dos indios y un moreno. This is a polite term for black, to say brown, right? And the Pope described the Virgin as the mother of all Cubans, regardless of race. And the bishop described her as a mestiza, just like our people. So so here's a little bit more front and center, talking by Catholic officials in public at a large gathering about race and the race of the Virgin, no less. So, and also that recognizing, and the Pope mentioned that El Cobre was the first place in Cuba where freedom was won for the slaves. So here there is knitting in this earlier narrative of the slaves' early devotion to the Virgin. They were her first devotees, her most faithful devotees, and they were rebel slaves, right? And so now, instead of just privileging that kind of independence narrative of, kind of Carlos Manuel de Céspedes and and the fight against Spanish colonialism, now that earlier narrative about slave insurrection is being brought in and knit into the narrative in a very public way by the Pope himself, who's, of course, is hearing from the bishops, on the ground about what's important pastorally, right? But so this crowning shows, was very influential to those who saw this on TV. And here is kind of further amplifying the presence of this narrative of the enslaved, all right, in the history of the cult. So this is in 2009. You can see here the influence of not only the kind of Marxist revolutionary milieu, which emphasizes los humildes, the most humble ones, right? But also the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, which said that the church needs to make a preferential option for the poor, and so here we see a kind of welding together of these priorities in the new sorts of catechisms that are being produced, all right, by Catholic bishops in more recent years. Here's a grandfather and his son, and they're in El Cobre at the Virgin's Shrine, and he's explaining to his grandson about the fight of the enslaved cobreros and how they were maltreated and they ran away, and that this made a strong unity. So this is kind of this new emphasis in this shift in kind of catechetical leanings has been very important just in recent years with the history of the cult. And also then with the visit of Pope Benedict, he came, Pope Benedict and Pope Francis actually both went to this tiny little town in El Cobre, which is just amazing. And just getting there is already a logistical feat. The roads are terrible, it's a tiny little town. But both Pope Benedict and Pope Francis ventured there, even spent the night there and prayed in front of the Virgin's image. This is just the pride of Cuba. The whole town was a Twitter, And I was there for the visit of Pope Benedict, and the Pope, prayed in front of the Virgin's image. And then he reported to the people, the townspeople were gathered outside. He said that I prayed in a special way to those who came here from Africa. And so it was a kind of deliberate reaching out of church institutions to gente popular, los humildes, blacks, all right, in a way that gave props, to the very origins of the cult. It only took 400 years, but anyway, we'll take it. There it is, kind of weaving in this history into this. So I'll end it there so that we can talk some more. All right? Yeah. Okay. Well, of course, churches, in various parts of the world, the importance of having public ceremonies in the streets and plazas, coming together for, Eucharistic conferences, et cetera, et cetera. This is something that's done, right? And this had been planned for some time already. Yeah, it took on an added valence, however, especially for some, this is what I heard, I saw and heard from kind of Catholic lay leaders that were there too. That we were going to show them, these are direct quotes, it's like we were going to show Castro he was not going to make this a communist country. And there was some concern among the episcopacy, and you can see it in the letters and stuff that I read in the archives, about the more leftward leaning, some of the policies that had happened over the past 10 months, leading up to this Catholic Congress. But the point of it was to bring Cubans together. All right. First of all, it was already planned. It was going to be planned. It took on added valences of bringing Cubans together, praying for unity because there was a lot of discord there, in the revolution. So kind of binding the wounds of the nation, unity, and also many of the speakers and even the clerics, who spoke at this Eucharistic Congress, they made explicit critiques of socialism, right? And there were chants. Also from the crowd that said caridad, sí, caridad, caridad, caridad. And it was doing this very repetition to the same rhythm as paredón, 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 which is to the wall, to the firing range, right? And that had been like in Fidel's, in those rallies, that had been paredón, paredón, to the firing wall. That had been the cheer, And then here it's caridad, caridad, caridad. So there were very direct critiques going on, through the chants and also through some of the sermons that were offered that made this. It was, very clear. And Fidel himself was upset the next day with what he had heard there. He was in attendance because he kind of had to. It was kind of be there or be square because but he was upset with some of the things that he heard, as were some of the more militant Marxist cadres. Because things hadn't split yet. So that big definitive split happens in 1961. But at this point, it is still possible to be a revolutionary and a churchman. And many people were. Yes, there were some of the same people there. But they were already within the inner circle, and there was already suspicion among some of Castro's people about the leftward turn, the way things were going. And people kept getting fired. I mean, you read the newspaper accounts, and this person's fired this week, and then the next time it's this one, and he was in the Sierra with Fidel, and he got fired. And so there's tension, going on there. But there's plenty of overlap there between being pro-revolutionary, maybe even fighting with Fidel, in the Revolutionary Army, and being a devotee of the Virgin and being Catholic. So there's not yet a split going on at this point in 1959, just kind of approached just historically. That really happens in 1961. That's when things really, after that feast day riot, basically, for the Virgin, that's when things really split apart. And then it's no longer, it's like, choose this day whom you will serve. Are you going to be a Catholic or are you going to be a revolutionary? And people had to make that choice. And some people left, some people went to jail, some people couldn't go to university, some people got fired from their jobs. I had friends who, they made a decision as a family that their kids were going to go to catechism. And it was at the same time, wouldn't you know, very conveniently, as the Young Communist League meeting. It was very, they would plan it during Sunday school hour and this sort of thing. So it was like very clear, But at this point, it's still possible. Yeah, other? I wanted to show a updated appropriation of Ochun that showed up recently for the shout out to the Bay Hive here. Beyonce in her video from Lemonade. Many people were making the connection between Ochun, and her, kind of going through the streets and the sorts of themes in her songs and stuff too. So this African-inspired religion is it's grown a lot lately, especially kind of among intelligentsia and artist types and this sort of thing. So these tropes have entered into a lot of conversations and artistic works that before wouldn't have happened. Yeah, so I first started doing my work there in 1997. And especially in the part of the country where I was, more conservative, more stalwart revolutionaries, because it was in the part around the Virgin's Shrine where a lot of the fighting had taken place. People were very poor, and they gained the most because of revolutionary policy. So the last Marxists in Cuba will be from that part of the country. They're just adamant. For instance, I stayed for many months at the home of a couple. The man had been with counterintelligence in the army, so this is someone that has passed lots of security clearances, right? His wife had been a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, one of very few women to reach that scope. So this is a family of some position, right? Fallen on hard times. Dad got fired from the from intelligence. We weren't supposed to ask why. Never did get but bad, And they opened up a guest house. The tourism economy. That's just would have been unthinkable for someone of that stature to do that, is that ensconced in the party apparatus, to have done something like that. And here we are, a bunch of Americans staying there. So she had been so stalwart in the 70s and 80s that she had served as the neighborhood watch captain. And so whenever the next door neighbor, this little old lady who was a spiritist medium, would have clients come by, so this is someone that they needed to commune with the spirits, right, in this sort of thing. So someone would come, kind of folk practices, and it was this woman's job to kind of keep an eye on who came and write down. Oh, well, Pedro came by at 10 p.m. on this night, and then Maria, So she was the eyes and ears of the party apparatus, informing on people in the neighborhood who were not maintaining what was considered, correct or doctrinaire Marxist orientation. So then, after a while living there, I noticed in one of the closets, I went to get a towel, and there's this huge shrine for San Lazaro with very freshly laid flower. I mean, it was very fresh. It wasn't just like it'd been, grandma put it in there 10 years ago or something. I was like, oh my gosh, this, there it was there in the closet. And then when the woman's own daughter made the heart-wrenching decision to leave Cuba, she went to visit this same spiritist neighbor next door who her mother had informed on a number of years ago, went to visit her and then did a very Cuban thing, went to the Virgin's shrine, a pedir la Virgen, to ask a favor of the Virgin, and also this woman also, did her own devotion. So people, they call it a doble cara, the two faces, and people complained about that, about the kind of demands of kind of public agreement, presumed unanimity with the regime, and yet this kind of private sphere that's kind of directly in contrast to the publicly professed beliefs over here. Yeah, so there's definitely that tension that Cubans have. But a lot of this did go on the down low. Some of these kind of private devotions and this sort of thing. Yeah, and like women that would have like a little medallion of the Virgin, but they wouldn't wear anymore their on a chain outside, but they would maybe pin it inside their bra, close to their heart. Those kinds of gestures, definitely happened. So a lot of tension like that. Well, what I've noticed with the folks that practice Santeria, it's kind of become this status thing. What used to, you saw how the police used to bust in on those people and like trash everything, and you only poor black people who were disreputable were doing this thing. Now it's like all these musicians and intellectuals and only people that have family living abroad that can send them money, and they have these lavish thrones and these lavish initiation parties. It's become a thing, So that's been a shift that I've seen, from something that was associated with poor, and poor black folks complain too. It's like, what happened? This used to be our thing. This is what we did to, for healing, and now it's like it's completely out of reach. I can't even like initiate my son anymore. This has gotten so expensive. So that's happened, as it's become increasingly this kind of marker of Cuban distinctiveness and something to attract tourists with and all that kind of thing. So there's that. Also, the church there has been offering some services. For instance, there's kind of a little business school there in the Diocese of Havana that offers training classes for entrepreneurs who are opening small, like home-based businesses that are now kind of somewhat allowed by the government, right? So that's something that the Diocese of Havana has been working on. So that, and there's, been, very gradually improving relationships between the church hierarchy and the government. It's helped since Raul has been in power, since Fidel stepped down 10-ish years ago. So that's changed. So there's, and Raul even made that offhand comment, everything Pope Francis is saying, I might just return to the church, and then the press, they were kind of laughing at him, and he said, he stopped, he says, I'm not kidding. I don't think he will. But he was just putting the press on notice too. It's like, hey, don't laugh, So, this is within the realm of possibility, something like that. So, so I've seen shifts there and kind of more openings for, different church initiatives. But it's still, just the default, it's a dictatorship. The default answer for everything is no. It's just very difficult to get things done, for reasons that are self-inflicted, that really don't have to do with, the U.S. embargo is horrible, and what's happening with the Trump administration vis-a-vis Cuba, these days is completely unnecessary and counterproductive. But there's, as Cubans often say, el bloqueo es por dentro. There's an internal blockade here that is as punishing as anything external also. That's self-imposed. I haven't gone since in the Trump administration yet. I usually try to go every year, but with everything that was happening in my town of Charlottesville this summer, I didn't go. this summer, so I haven't been yet under these new rules. I haven't had many problems in the past, but yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much.
Thanks.